Welcome to, let's see, we're week 11 of the California Countercultures course, and I am delighted. I'm going to let people sort of settle in. Happy to see all of you. I'm reminding everyone who's already been following the course, as well as the students, that this is Thinking Through Art and Design at Berkeley, the Big Ideas course entitled California Countercultures. And it is supported by the Mellon Foundation and the Doug and Lisa Goldman Trust, and is organized through the Arts and Design Initiative here at Berkeley. Fred Tomaselli, who was billed in the printed what is it, the Berkeley, does it have a name? The catalog, the program, had a personal family matter about 3 weeks ago, told us that he couldn't be here today. So online, we quickly asked a wonderful colleague and an artist in our community, Stephanie Syjuco, a professor here at Berkeley, I'll do an introduction in a moment, to come in and talk about her latest work that seemed to fit very much into our curriculum of the California Countercultures and hippie modernism. So for the students this week, in week 11 on Monday, we had a course on psychedelic culture and LSD, and we had a visiting lecturer here. We were delighted to have Dr. Yelena Martinovic, who's a specialist in the history of science and psychedelia, who's doing her postdoc at Harvard and who spoke to the students about psychedelia. So one of the things that coming up this next month, we have 4 more weeks. We're really entering into the period in the course where we're looking at the kind of inheritance of the counterculture. We've done the deep historical work, and we're now, well, maybe not deep, but at least we've done a lot of the periodizing, and we have arrived at a moment where we'll be investigating the inheritance of this period of the 60s and 70s. So that, in that context, I wanted to introduce Stephanie Syjuco. Stephanie has Stephanie, first of all, I met in 2004. I curated a show entitled Botany 12, loosely based on Michael Pollan's book that had just come out that year called The Botany of Desire. And Michael Pollan, who's a professor here at Berkeley. And this was up at Sonoma, and we were starting a big museum project, but we had a small space. And I had discovered Stephanie's work as a Stanford MFA, right? And so I've been following Stephanie's work very closely since then. So Stephanie Syjuco creates large-scale spectacles of collected cultural objects, cumulative digital and analog archives, and temporary vending installations. I laugh because I've used them and they're fantastic. Using critical wit and collaborative co-creation, her projects leverage open source systems, shareware logic, and flows of capital in order to investigate issues of economies and empire. Stephanie was born in the Philippines in 1974, and she received her MFA from Stanford and BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute, which is a very specific moment in art making at the San Francisco Art Institute. She is a recipient of a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship Award and a 2009 Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculpture Award. I have mentioned earlier that Stephanie may be the most prolific artist I know of. I really mean this, and is constantly negotiating between her own practice as an artist and her position as an assistant professor in the art practice department here, a theoretician, an art producer, and what else are we negotiating? Many other hats. So I'm really delighted to have Stephanie here today, because post-Trump, in this post-Trump electoral climate, Stephanie Syjuco, in her incredible productivity, really felt compelled as an artist, as a human being, and a professor here at Berkeley, to really look at what was happening in politics. And recently we just put together, with the help of Julie Simpson, a series of protest posters which can be seen on the hour, every hour, on the screen here at the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archives, of protest posters. And what Stephanie did, and I found it online on Facebook, was that she created a an online, how can we say that, an open source political protest poster resource that could teach you how to make posters and give you the different elements that you needed to create your own protest posters. Is that right? And you'll talk about it. So I felt that it was a really wonderful opportunity to have Stephanie here. I'm going to continue on a little bit about Stephanie's biography since it's so rather extraordinary. I don't want to leave anything out, but I will be leaving a lot out. Her work has been included in exhibitions at MoMA, PS1, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the California Biennial, the 12th Havana Biennial, the 2015 Asian Art Biennial in Taiwan, among others. She's currently developing a new work with SF MoMA for their major initiative, Public Knowledge, which will be unveiled in 2018. So she's also taught at Stanford, as well as CCA and the Art Institute and Carnegie Mellon, and just came back from, you were teaching at, were you? Parsons in NYU this week. In 2013, she joined the faculty at UC Berkeley as an assistant professor in sculpture, and in my humble opinion, most importantly, she was raised here in the Bay Area, but in the 80s, not the 70s here. So welcome to Stephanie.
Great. That's a good setup, Natasha, but that's going to be hard to follow. Anyway, hi. Thank you for being here, especially for those that are not enrolled in the class. The fact that you came here at lunchtime, I think, is wonderful. So happy to be here. Let's see. Let me start up my computer again. And as Natasha was saying, so we met a while ago, and just to kind of reiterate a little bit of what she was saying, my background is in sculpture, but I happen to do a lot of projects that are very kind of interactive or create platforms for public engagement. And it's kind of, it's shaped a lot of how the artwork looks. And so when I was coming up with the title for the talk today, I decided to frame it around art, politics, and aesthetics. And it's kind of timely in many ways because Natasha kind of introduced the idea of, you know, what artists are sort of responding to today, but also thinking about the legacy of the decades prior. So thankfully, you've been looking at the counterculture. I was raised in the 80s, so that was kind of like the real hangover of the 60s and 70s, and that reality was really different. And so when I'm talking about notes from the field, I think I'm really saying my field. I don't want to speak for all artists working in response to or making art today. But, so the artwork that I generally make is pretty large scale. It involves collaborations with nonprofits, institutions, and museums to create these sort of large scale spectacles of objects. Many times they involve the public in producing the things for it, as well as being participating in the distribution of it. So I'm actually not going to focus on a lot of the works that are, I would say, kind of discretely gallery-based. I also have a very strong gallery-based practice where I work with commercial galleries and we create objects that are, you know, for sale in kind of a traditional artwork way. I'm really going to focus on what I consider social practice projects, and those are the ones that engage the public. The very first time I started thinking about it was when I was in graduate school in 2004, by that time I'd had already a 10-year practice as a professional artist here in the Bay Area. And I was starting to get kind of fed up with what I felt were those limits. And that was the kind of limitation of audience where you, as an artist, you make something in the privacy of your studio, then you put it out into a kind of white wall art space, and then you wait for people to show up, and then the whole thing's over after a while. Hopefully you make some sales, hopefully you don't, but that's a pretty, you know, one-directional kind of conversation. So in 2003, I think, I started a project kind of on a whim called the Counterfeit Crochet Project, Critique of a Political Economy, in which I created a website that invited crochet crafters from all over the world to join me in creating their own handmade versions of high-end designer objects using crochet. So at the very bottom is the tagline that says, "Debasing and defiling designer items one step at a time." And in order to kind of get this project rolling, I made one sample, which was this counterfeit crochet Chanel purse using the humble art of crochet, posted it online, and then sat back as the fabulous folks all around the world started to send me submissions for the project. This is a shot of Carrie in Ohio with her handmade Dior bucket bag. And the challenge was that all makers were supposed to go online, find a handbag that they wish they owned but could not afford, and then hand make it. And then take photos of themselves modeling it in some way. And I blacked out their eyes because essentially what they're doing is illegal. This is Diana in Portland with her Dior handbag. Nicole in Mississippi with her Dolce & Gabbana. And the fun thing about this project was that it didn't involve artists per se. This was a kind of DIY craft community that was just starting to form in the early 2000s. And this was pre-Etsy. And so before craft kind of became this real commodified, very popular commercial endeavor, it was actually this kind of very DIY, radical collection of people. Just meeting online and sharing ideas. This is Katie in London with her Louis Vuitton Murakami Papillon bag, and Katie went to the Louis Vuitton store to model hers. This is Wendy in Michigan with her Fondi purse. And the wonderful thing about this project, too, is that it took advantage of people's skill sets, but it also directly reflected the low quality of some people's skill sets. So if you look at the way that, Wendy has tried to tackle those complicated Fs on the handbag, it obviously reflects her own knowledge of crochet. This is Carrie in Ohio, again with her a sample of her Coach bag in progress. And the original JPEG is the image on the left, and then that's her thing on the right. And she sent me this image, and she was so upset because she couldn't get the object made correctly. And I said to her, well, when you think about it, there is an absolute impossibility in trying to hand make a high-end designer object. And the thing on the right actually reflects your own humanity and your own kind of the roughness of it, what it means to be a human being in the world. I also see it as, the thing on the left is also a JPEG, which is a digitized, low-resolution version of a real object. And you could also agree that the thing on the right is also a low-resolution version of the object, only an object. And the Counterfeit Crochet project grew to expand into lots of other fields. So I was invited to lead workshops all around the world. And it essentially consisted of myself sitting at a table with a lot of yarn and crochet hooks and teaching people how to create these knockoffs. Invariably, what would happen were these wonderful discussions about black market economies, craft traditions, and different kind of political ways that people are tackling issues of consumerism. They've also turned into large-scale installations. So, from the humble beginnings of the website, this is a version of the project at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco that also incorporated a site for people to work in the space, and objects were displayed by people who had made the works prior, along with images and samples and swatches. And the same thing with, I designed downloadable instruction sheets and graphics to kind of prompt people on how to make some of these logos. And the fun thing about this project was that, nothing was for sale. Oh, I see a question up there. Oh, very. That is a good question. Okay, so the reason I chose crochet was because actually knitting is considered a high-end craft. Crochet is seen as a kind of lower class craft, and I know that sounds interesting. I mean, it's actually part of a lot of cultural traditions in many ways, but it's a very common thing. You see discarded crochet objects in thrift stores all the time, and it's not seen as super high. And yes, men did it, but it kind of depended on the country too. So the downloadable graphics were available, and you could see, the different messages like "Make it Chanel, baby," "Getting the Gucci look." And everything was fine and dandy until 2009 when I was hit with a cease and desist letter from Louis Vuitton. And this was a 5-page letter that directly outlined all the ways in which my project was infringing on their copyright and trademarks and everything. They also sent me this really wonderful article from Harper's Bazaar on the fight against fakes, and essentially equating my project to issues of child labor, terrorism, and human trafficking. So the funny thing about this for me was as a kind of way to think about how a very simple and even satirical idea can cross and bleed into a reality of sorts. That was really fascinating, and it kind of started to prompt more of my thinking in terms of other artworks. I'm also really curious about the kind of networks that happen around these projects. So there's a kind of visible quality. So when you show up to a workshop or you look at an object that was made for the artwork, you can see it. But I'm also interested in the kind of social network and hierarchical strategies that happen behind the scenes. So this is my production flow schematic for the project, which shows the counterfeit crochet project in the middle, crafters on the outside, creating ideas and objects, and then they filter those objects into the exhibition space where then it infects other crafters who come to see it and then goes back into the cycle. Counter that, or in contrast, is the production flow schematic of a traditional fashion house in which designers at the top create the ideas, which then filter down to the factories, which mass produce them, then to be purchased by consumers. And so that's a very hierarchical, different model. And I'm more interested in the kind of, communal or collective idea of production. And so to kind of further this idea, in 2009, I was invited to participate in the Frieze Art Fair, which is a high-end art fair that happens in London every year. And as part of their commissions, they like to ask artists to do something that is on site and is specifically about the fair. So I decided to propose a project called Copy Stand, an autonomous manufacturing zone. And this is my 3D model that shows my concept sketch, which will give me a gallery booth in the fair, so right next to all the other galleries selling things and very high-end, expensive art world items. But in my own booth, I would divide it so that on the left-hand side, I would set up a live production space in which I would hire 5 young artists to bootleg and counterfeit other artworks being sold at the fair. And as soon as they were finished, we would push them over to the right-hand side in our gallery space and then sell them to the public at drastically reduced prices. So the project actually ran for 5 days. It was a real, kind of effort. This is my team hard at work, making their counterfeits on site and in view of the public. This is one of my artists, Jim Ricks, counterfeiting a Philip Guston painting, with the original selling for about 200,000 pounds down the hallway, and ours selling for 200 pounds, which is about, what's the exchange rate now? About $300 maybe? And the trick was we had to create all the work so quickly and on site that we had to use really basic art supplies. And so there's this really interesting kind of stutter between the high-end art object and our kind of craft store, art store versions. This is our research and production space in which we printed out samples of the artworks that were to be counterfeited. And 3 days before the opening of the fair, I sent out my artists to document the uncrating of all the other works so that we could figure out what we wanted to counterfeit. This is a shot on the very first day of the gallery, open to the public, ready for business. Nothing was over 500 pounds, so it was a very, very affordable fair, considering that this was in a fair in which literally an artwork from an artist like Damien Hirst would be, £1 million. And over the course of the fair, 35,000 people attended, and we became this really amazing kind of landing pad for people curious about the economy of art and also their ability to access it or not access it. And I think for me, the questions that it raises are issues of, again, the kind of elitism of a system that is, a kind of cultural production, but excludes as much as it includes, at least, decides to include a very small amount of people generally, and then the rest of us are just onlookers. But with our remakes, you could have them too. So this is the artist, we copied a drawing from the artist David Shrigley, my artist, Jim Ricks, was hand drawing it when two very well-dressed women came up to watch him and were nervously talking to themselves, and he turned to them and said, "Yeah, could you believe this original drawing is selling for 20,000 pounds down the way? It's so easy to copy." And they looked at him and they said, "Yes, we know, we are his German gallerists." So as soon as the people started to figure out what was happening, we would get visits from the gallerists themselves, trying to make sure that the quality of our work was either up to par or just bad enough so it couldn't be mistaken as their own. And we were also really popular with the artists that we did knock off. They came to also look at the things that we made of theirs. As soon as people bought things, we wrapped them up and sold them and moved it immediately out the door to make more work. And then on the very last day, I decided that we needed a massive blowout sale. Because similar to the idea of starting up a business, the entire fair itself was the duration of a business model. So we produced all the inventory on site, we sold it all, and then we needed to shut down. So the liquidation sale happened. And if you can imagine this setup right next door to a high-end commercial gallery, desperate to kind of make sure that its prices and its kind of public face, was very high-end, this is the last thing that you wanted to be next to. And in the end, we sold everything. So we slashed everything to 50% off, everything went out the door. And I like to also talk about the background, the economic background behind this piece, because we operated on an alternative economic model in which all the artists were able to choose what they wanted to counterfeit. They were able to set their prices within the 500-pound range, and then they kept 100% of their sales, which is a very different format from how a commercial gallery system works. And again, it's not just about the way the project looks, but the kind of tinkering with the backstory and the back machinations to see what else is possible, given the current state of capitalism. And in 2010, I was invited to do a project at the San Francisco Museum of no, because they would look really bad if they had a problem with it. We were sanctioned by the Frieze Art Fair, which meant that we were a commissioned project, and at first there was definitely consternation, but then it became a badge of honor to be knocked off because it meant that your artwork was actually important enough to be counterfeited and shown twice at the fair. Another question up there? Yeah.
And counterfeit is laden with a lot of baggage, if you will, and we saw that in the cease letter. Why did you choose one over the other, and why did you lead with counterfeit?
You know what? That's a good question. I'm actually, for the sake of the rest of the time, I'm going to pick that one up at the end, if it's okay. And I'm actually, if it's all right with everyone, I'm also going to hold off on the questions, because we're going to have a pretty rich discussion time at the end. And so I'm going to power through all this stuff and then give us as much time as possible. But thanks for the questions. With Shadow Shop, this was a 5-month project. It was essentially a store that was embedded in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in their galleries, and even though it operated as a regular store, it covered 4 different themes, artwork as commodity, cultural souvenirs, bootlegs and counterfeits, and alternative distribution systems. And so for 5 to 6 months, you could visit, and it looked like this. And as soon as you kind of started to poke around a little bit, though, you started to realize that things were a little not what they seemed, because the thousands of objects embedded in it were commissioned by 200 different artists in the Bay Area to respond to the condition of being commodified as artists. And what that meant was different products that they were creating. So this is a set of other people's memories. And so for $2.99, you could buy, I think, 5 photographs that had been discarded and found in the thrift store, and they were new to you. This is San Francisco fog and also ethnic flavor. So you always kind of it's, when people think about San Francisco, they want to take home a little bit of, something of it. Ethnic flavor, you could always use more of that. And so the artist tackled them in different ways. This is I'm in Ye, which is You Can Also Be a Painter of Light, which is a mugshot of the painter Thomas Kincaid, which has been turned into a color by number, but it's a mugshot from when he was arrested for drunk driving. This is Gordon Wieniemko's Art Rocks, which for $20 you could purchase a box with 2 rocks inside and a map that showed you how to drive from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to the California State Capitol, where then you take out the rocks and throw them at the Capitol to protest cuts in arts funding. This is Chris Bell with Cheap Money, and so for 99 cents you could buy $1. And he said, literally, as an artist, I lose money all the time when I make my artwork. So in order to kind of create this piece, he made it the subject of the piece. And he limited it to 500, an edition of 500. So he stopped his losses. I also commissioned a number of performative projects to happen. So the Shadow Shopping Channel was a live streaming event, kind of like a QVC, in which 3 performance artists acted as kind of MCs and promoted the objects for sale and had the artists on as kind of guest speakers. And then at the end of the project, I also needed a massive closing down sale because again, we were embedded in the museum. We had a finite amount of funds, but I decided to model it as if we were being kicked out or thrown out of business. So 100% back to artists, worst business model ever. Fun while it lasted, everything must go. Goodbye, SF MoMA, it's been real. And there was truth in that because we were a bad business model. I turned 100% of the sales directly back to the artists. And so if you look at the economic figures at the end, in 5 months, we included over 200 artists. We sold over 10,000 items to the public and made over $105,000 in sales. And it more than tripled the museum's investment directly back to the artists, which means that if they had commissioned an artwork, the total budget was $35,000. If they had spent that on an artwork that was put in the gallery, it wouldn't have generated the capital return. And I'm interested in how those models can work within institutions. And so tripling that resource and sending it back to the arts community was my way of taking from that power structure and disseminating it out to those that directly needed it. Another project involving accumulating and distributing. This is Free Texts, an open source reading room, which was at the the 01 Biennial in San Jose in 2012. And it appears to be a bookshelf kind of reading area with an office in the back and a kind of flyer wall and a library space. And the flyer wall was the main focus, and you could go up to it, and advertised were a series of free texts that were, similar to the kind of flyers where you see the tear tabs, and each text advertised an issue about property. So everything having to do with the idea of the commons, of ownership, of property in the digital era, and of copyright. And you could tear off one of the tabs, and if you typed it in, you could download your own free PDF of the text. So essentially what you were doing was breaking copyright by becoming a downloader of the file. And the irony of this too is that I didn't upload any of these files. I actually just found them floating on the internet, and they've been posted by other people all over the world. And it creates this kind of visual representation of a network that's actually in existence already, hidden, but when you make it physical, you get this whole different effect. And I also had a kind of production desk where I would sit and act as a librarian, answering people's questions, soliciting more titles to be added to the collection, and then also just kind of talking through some of the issues around the idea of digital copyright and ownership. The project is really elegant in that it travels easily. It's essentially a series of PDF files that can be downloaded and sent anywhere in the world to be displayed. And I see it as an aggregating project, which means that wherever it's shown, I collaborate with a curator to add texts to the collection. And so depending on the theme and the topic and the country in which it's shown, it actually reflects those localized concerns. This is in Thailand, in the Bangkok Art and Culture Center, and it happened during the same time as the political coup in 2013. And during that time, the government was actually shutting down a lot of social media websites, so people's posts on Facebook about the protests, and in some cases, some of the violence that was happening against protesters was being removed. It was really interesting to witness that and how easy it was for the government to get Facebook to just, take things off and silence people. And interestingly, this my project became a way for the curators there to start posting texts that were difficult to find during the time of the political coup. So it became an active resource center for folks seeking information. And it also reflected, local concerns. So in Thai as well. And again, some of the main issues on that they were really interested in were issues of post-coloniality and the art world in relationship to the global art world. So the other thing I'm really interested in are DIY videos on how to make things. And I was doing research on YouTube is a fabulous space for sharing. And it seems like you can find how-to videos on almost anything. And I became really fascinated in the videos being shown on how to make fake weed. And a lot of them were posted by teenagers, and they involve using common household or supermarket goods to create, simulated weed. And in some cases, too, it looked like they were making them for film props or theater props, but they were really bad. I mean, their final product was really bad. And so I decided that I thought artists could do a better job. So I did a project called Faux Rwanda, where I bought all the ingredients that were outlined by these different videos from the supermarket. You can see this wonderful list here, everything from oregano, parsley, basil, Kool-Aid, pancake syrup, soap, and plastic wrap. And then from there, worked with a number of artists on a kind of challenge. So this was at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, where I was an artist in residence, and these were my fellow artist friends. I set them up to try to work and create a better product in 36 hours using their own artistic skills. And so this is them with all the beer that I gave them and during their making work. And it was really amazing. They worked really hard. They also had a ton of skill sets. And then at the end, for the jurying process, the final jurors were the director and curators of the Bemis Arts Center, thus implicating the institutional hierarchy into this judging of fake drugs. And the irony of it is that I don't do drugs. So this isn't something like near and dear to my heart, but what's fascinating is that I guess almost every other artist does. And so everyone's kind of histories and experience with it informed how they decided to make their bud of choice. Weirdly enough, I won the process, so my winning one is on the right, the bottom right, and I guess that means that I'm just very observant. And so I've got a couple more projects just to wrap up, and then I'm going to slide into a whole other series of works where I talk about it less in the context of art making and more about my work as being a citizen. But back to artworks, this is Money Factory, an economic reality game, which was a commission for the Asian Art Biennial in Taiwan. And they were really interested in me producing a work that reflected on the current economic conditions. Taiwan right now is going through a kind of a recession of sorts. It's very difficult for young folks to get jobs and kind of attain this goal of an upwardly mobile middle class. And so my idea was to create this kind of factory system that would collapse an entire year's worth of work and production to show how difficult it is to get what you want. It consisted of a large area that museum visitors could come to and make things at this table. And the first step was that you go to a kind of front desk where you get handed a stack of cut and paste stacks of money. And you got enough that would symbolize 1 year's worth of salary. And then you would sit, and then you would also were given a menu, which showed you after you created 1 year's worth of salary, what you could buy with that based on what people had targeted as their life goals. So things like, having a small family, getting an apartment, buying a scooter, starting your own business. And then it took you about maybe half an hour to make a year's worth of salary. And the amazing thing about this process was it was really popular. Like, people were losing their minds over making money. And the fact that it was this kind of crafted proxy versus the real thing didn't really matter. People would set their children to make them, and they would kind of police them to make sure that they were making their money correctly. And we also let all the trash accumulate on the ground. So the piles of paper that you saw was sort of the leftovers of these money stacks. Over the course of 5 months, it grew, and it kind of reflected this idea of this hidden labor in this accelerated space. And then after you were done making your money stacks, you could go to the bank, where then you would trade in and buy the things that you wanted with your money. And that was based on what you filled out on the menu. And in exchange, to get these things, you were given postcards with the object printed out as a kind of goal. And what was amazing was people worked really, really hard for the postcard that they wanted. And what was also happening was this space in which large groups of people were able to congregate, and in that kind of workshop, informal atmosphere, start to have conversations with themselves about their role in the economy and capitalism and how difficult it was to achieve what they wanted. So apart from this being a kind of visual spectacle, it also, for me, was this kind of space of reckoning that slowed people down. And it's humorous, but it's kind of real, because in the end, what people found out is that they couldn't achieve what they wanted, that it was virtually impossible given the way that the system was set up. But they could pretend. So the bank vault that we had was an open air one, and so we would just stack all the money up in one area, and people took massive amounts of selfies with them. And these images circulated around Taiwan, which I thought was really funny too. And so I think the last project that I'm going to show that's considered art in this kind of art form is in 2015, I was invited to participate in the Havana Biennial. And this was 2 months after the US lifted their travel restrictions to Cuba. And so prior to that, it was very difficult to get in, or you had to kind of, as an American, you had to circumvent your route and either go through Mexico or a second country before traveling on to Cuba. Well, the trade restrictions have been reconsidered, and travel is now more open. But the interesting effect is going to be how Cuba and Cubans are going to be able to handle that difference in economic structure. And so I did a project called Hecho en Cuba, which was called Made in Cuba, and it consisted of a performative factory installation and trading post in which I worked with a seamstress and 3 undergraduate art history students who were kind of assigned to me by the Cuban government. And what we did was we set up this live space where we handmade souvenir tote bags for the biennial, and you could watch us do that. So you saw all the production that went into it. And then we, after finishing them, we traded them to the public. So no money was for sale. No money was taken in exchange for our goods. When you came to our trading post, you had to offer us different things. And this was a way to kind of flatten out the economic disparity between local Cubans who couldn't afford very much, and then the wealthy tourists that would come through and be able to just slap down 50 cents in order to buy whatever they wanted. And this was a really weird playing field, because one, it was so unexpected that, okay, well, what do you value and what do I value, and what do you think is important enough for this object that is handmade and right over there? And in many cases, we haggled really strongly, and it became this interesting conversation with people about why their thing was so valuable. And over the course of the 5 days, we would accumulate the different objects, and it also kind of became a portrait of the country and who passed by and the spaces. And not all trades were successful. A lot of trades were also, we turned people away. And I think that was also kind of shocking. Well, why don't you like my thing? And we would say, well, we've kind of seen 10 things like that before. Can you give us something more interesting? And then sometimes they would come back with something more interesting. And we'd say, okay, this is better. But the funny thing about it, too, is that the disparity of the objects we were offered and given. The things on the left are a Chanel lipstick and a pass to the Frieze New York Art Fair, which obviously came from a very wealthy tourist. And then on the right are two books that mean a lot to the local population that someone just happened to be carrying around. And this notion of kind of like value and how to convince us what what we should think is important and then what you think of is important became a strong component of the piece. Okay, so in transitioning, I also really want to stress that. So, I make these things as artworks. They exist in, art worlds and in museums and institutions and art fairs. And so there's this kind of definition about that. But there's obviously bleed in many ways in the sense that, as an artist, I also see myself as a citizen. And I try not to, I have a hard time distinguishing sometimes between the two things. But for the sake of definitions, I have to. This is a project that I worked on in response to this thing that came up in Mission Local, which is a kind of journal put out about the Mission neighborhood. That I was a resident in the Mission District for about 20 years until finally moving 2 years ago because of the rising rents and trying to avoid being evicted. But Mission Local published this call to bedazzle a tech bus, and they were soliciting artists to generate designs to decorate tech buses because they were so ugly, and why not make them pretty? Myself and so many other artists living in the Mission took huge offense to this idea, that it was a complete misfire, that it completely derailed any notion of why artists need to participate in this when they're evicting us based on the economy of Silicon Valley and the commuters that are taking over our art spaces. And so with that, I decided to do a project, and it existed online. It was called Bedazzle a Tech Bus. I mock up your ideas. And it was a Facebook call that basically said, I used to work as a graphic designer which functioned as a service for making other people's ideas look good. Part of my job was mocking up fictional proposals for future things to potentially exist. In response to Mission Local's challenge for San Franciscans to bedazzle a tech bus, I invited people to tell me what they wanted to see, and I would create it for them to the best of my ability in hopes that they submit it to the competition. So the idea was Mission Local was going to publish every submission that it got to this. And so by me kind of like upping the stakes for it and asking and doing other people's work in order to create the submissions, I wanted to accelerate what was viewed. This is my first attempt at a submission, which this is called Public Comfort, and it's wrapping a Google bus in a visual of a San Francisco Muni bus, so it looked like a public bus. This is the artist Michael McConnell. So people would just email me, make it look like this, and I would mock it up and then email them back the JPEG, and then they had to submit it to Mission Local. So this is the rents in San Francisco at the time, which shockingly are not that expensive now. This is David Lawrence. This is Cattle Car Tech Bus. So wrapping the Google bus in just like a cattle car, as if shipping these tech workers off to where they belong. This is Joe McKay with his Google account policy bus, which is just wrapping the bus in the privacy, what Google is able to do with your information once they have it. This is Russell Blank, a Trojan horse bus, so wrapped in a beautiful painting. This is Adriana Camarena with her encampment bus. And so how this project functioned was I created the platform, other people created the content and the idea, and then I facilitated it. And it's a way that I like to work because I feel like it adds to a kind of a polyphonic way for people to share their viewpoints. And it keeps me away from being an author, but also maybe promoting things that I personally maybe not be able to stand behind or want to do, but I think is, it's a valid, thought. So this is John Gourley's Gringo Bus. And since this was all unfolding on Facebook, there's, a really lively commentary happening about, what this means and why this is happening. And remember, these are also propositions. These things never existed. It was online. But it was a real reflection, too, of the kind of anger and invisibility that artists and creative folks in the mission were feeling. And, rather than decorate it, this is what they could get. So in the end, what was hilarious, this is a screenshot of Mission Local, and this is 5 out of so every day we were like pummeling them with these different designs. And you could kind of see, so mine, or the ones that I helped facilitate, are the first 5. And then the last one there is someone who just painted it. That had nothing to do with that. But imagine, like, if we didn't put these up, what submissions they would be getting, which is literally to decorate a Google bus. So again, back to this idea of participation as a citizen. If I think about the kind of 3 spheres in which I have to operate in, and Natasha was kind of mentioning that, the artist and their role, and specific to me, I think about, the art world, the academy, and that's the space that we're occupying right now. And, I have a really specific job in that academy, and sometimes that job limits me in certain ways, and it also frees me up in different ways. But it's different from what I can do in the art world, and it's also different from what I can do in the public as a citizen. So I'm going to focus on that a little bit more. And by citizen, I don't mean citizen as an American citizen. I just mean citizen in terms of being a civic participant, like someone invested in the idea of civic life and everyone's ability to speak within it. Immediately after the 2016 election, I was one of those people that felt that there was, a sense of kind of loss, a sense of just not really knowing what else to do. And I'm actually choking up about it right now. There was, it's like, I don't really know what we're supposed to do, and just recalling, like, in the middle of it, it was, the idea of being an artist and putting things out in the world. The one thing I remember realizing that I had, and many of us have, are a kind of visual vision. The ability to put things out, to reflect differently on the reality. So I started a project. This is one of the first banners that I made. And I just didn't really know what to react to or how to do anything. So I just made and was kept making. And eventually they turned into all forms of just like sewn banners. And I was posting images of them online. People were wanting to know how I made them, if I could share them, and really trying to figure out how they could also, find ways to just put their own messages out in the world. So these are some of the images of the initial ones that I made. I lend them out to people to use in protests and demonstrations. I've stopped making them too because they take a lot of time, and I have other things that I need to take care of. But the way that it goes onwards is via a publicly accessible Google Doc, which has downloadable templates and instructions on how to make your own. So when I first put this up in December, it traveled widely, and I've seen so many versions. These files are cut and paste, which means that you can segment out just bits of it that you want. You can use them as, you could change them in any way. They're completely open source. And as I've looked at images through protests all over the world, I've actually seen these, my designs tailored and used. And so it's been this really kind of wonderful way to see how things move. And it also kind of came from looking at historical examples of, fabric banner making, which is, very traditional in many ways, but, the gorgeous examples from the suffragette movement of those seeking women's voting rights, both in the UK and in the US, they're beautiful, and they were these, real attention to detail crafted objects. So I was looking at these, and then also some of the images and posters and graphics of ACT UP. That was the active all over the world, but was centered a lot in New York and the Bay Area. Because growing up in the 80s era in San Francisco, and being completely witness and privy to the AIDS activism that was happening here, it really shaped my worldview. Because if it weren't for this type of visual that the artists were producing out in the world, the government was not going to pay attention. And these were some of the images also of, so these were on on the sides of buses in San Francisco. And as a kid growing up in elementary school, seeing this, it really stuck with me. This idea that, you could kind of promote these very personal images and use them as a kind of platform for larger things. And, I was also thinking about the AIDS memorial quilt, which, is also another kind of famous memorial and monument project. Also Occupy Wall Street, which had an amazing graphical presence. Black Lives Matter, which also has kind of created a really savvy campaign. The No Dapple water rights, which unfortunately has seemed to kind of taken a backward step, but the protest banners. And so I started working on these two. This is a banner that I did for Rebecca Solnit when she was organizing a protest at the state capitol, and she needed something really quick. She contacted me on a Sunday and was like, or Saturday, and was like, I'm doing this thing Monday. I was like, okay, I can get you this thing. So I made a 12-foot banner, and they read a rewritten version of the Declaration of Independence on the steps of the California State Capitol. This was right before the electors were going to vote, and so this was a direct protest to that. And it's just been really wonderful kind of being involved in this, and also as a kind of service. So I don't like authoring these things. I don't think there's any reason to author it. I get a lot of opportunities to author things, but I really want to put my skills to service, and I think there's a lot of ways that can happen. So I also was doing, I also put together Reap What You Sow, which is the protest banner workshop and sewing circle, and I held different events for that at Royal Nonsuch Gallery in Oakland, at the Southern Exposure Gallery in San Francisco, at the Oakland Art Museum, and then also here at UC Berkeley. And it was amazing. This was in preparation for the women's marches. So many people didn't know how to create the messages that they wanted to create. And so we set up free workshops for them to have fabric, use templates if they want, or just go to town. And it was this really beautiful kind of coming together of people just making and talking together and thinking about the messages that they wanted to send out in the world. And it was collective and collaborative, and there were many artists that I'm also not able to kind of voice right now, but it's, we produced all these things, and in the end, we saw them out in the world too. So again, just looking at the images out there, it's been really wonderful to think that it's been a good platform for this. And I'm going to end too with a couple highlights of other things that you guys should know about. Artists are active in so many ways right now, and locally, 100 Days Action is a collective website and series of events that's happening. You can go to their website to find out more. Anti-Lab is opening Thursday night. It's a resource center for creative resistance in Oakland. Again, many artists are collaborating and running public workshops in them. And also designing and creating their own things to put out in the world. So the artist Jesselyn Alland, she teaches high school, and so she made a zine, which is a guide for youth protesters. Aram Han Cifuentes in Chicago made a protest banner lending library. Just Seeds is a wonderful website that's a collective of artists where you can go and download free graphics that were designed by artists and use them in any way. And also just thinking about like lasting effect. So after the Women's March protest, people were creating these monuments in which they were, leaving their handmade signs up. And interestingly enough, the Smithsonian is collecting them. So they're already being put into a kind of historical model, which is fascinating. I mean, it's interesting that we can kind of historicize immediately what's happening daily. And weirdly enough, the anti-Trump protests are boosting art supply sales, which, it's both good and bad, because this article actually ends with talking to a CEO of an art supply company saying, we see opportunity in these protests. And, thinking too, like, well, what does a banner do? Like, what can it really do? Well, when this one came out, I feel like it did a lot. It did a lot for me at the moment I saw it. And it doesn't change things politically directly necessarily, but, it does change the possibility of things. And lastly, I want to end too. This is an image of Bree Newsom, a filmmaker and activist who literally climbed the South Carolina State House to take down the Confederate flag. And that one symbolic act basically created the removal of that flag in perpetuity. They voted to never fly it again at the state capitol. And so, I think in thinking about this idea of, well, does art have any impact? Do I as an individual citizen have an impact? There are definitely symbolic ways in which the production of an alternative or a powerful image or object out in the world can have ripple effects. And I would really want to encourage everybody to, put that on their plate as possibilities. So I think that is my last image. Thank you very much. And so we have time for a question and answer. And actually, I see some of my students here from my 1 o'clock class, and I will let you know that you can stay as long as you want. I will not count you late by arriving to class. So there you go. And we do have time for questions. There are people walking around with microphones, so you're going to have to raise your hand, and then they'll come find you. Oh, sure. Yeah. Whee. Wow, look at that.
There it is. I mean, to really see what you're doing, I think that for the audience to really see the type of work you're doing, to look at this graph is pretty extraordinary. So thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, thank you. Really, I'm happy to entertain anything. I'm friendly.
Thank you. I thought that was really interesting. I thought that your projects were really incisive in the way that they hold up a mirror to the way that we engage with our economic establishments. And I was really interested in your comments on copyright because I've been thinking a lot about copyright from a different perspective. So in science, the merit of your scientific research is measured by the prestige of the journal that you publish in. And that means that this has sort of led to a tyrannical hegemony of the most prestigious journals in the world where publishing a handful of articles in Science, Nature, and Cell can get you a professorship. And that means that this has also made these articles sort of guardians of humanity's most exciting knowledge because the authors often sign over their copyrights when they publish their research in these journals. And that means that they now own this information and contribute the distribution of this knowledge that can really belong to anyone. This means that they sell it to the public at prices of $30 to $45 for a single article, which is completely unreasonable, and sell it to institutions in bundles that include subscriptions by the publishing house to Nature and a bunch of smaller journals that nobody wants to buy, also at exorbitant prices. This has led to a big pushback where now people are creating spaces like open access journals where you can publish your research and make it available to everyone. But there's been a big concern by young scientists because how can you establish your own reputation as a scientist if you're not complicit in this sort of structure and you don't publish in the same kind of journals that lead to professorships? I think it's really interesting that some of these journals, the open access ones, are actually opened by a Nobel Prize winner, somebody who's already extremely well established. And the articles that show up there are often from labs where the professors already have tenure. So I was wondering if maybe in the artistic community there are similar obstacles where can young artists establish themselves, their reputation, sense of respect and productivity without displaying at places like the MoMA and the Smithsonian with these altered distribution structures, and if you see ways to get around these obstacles.
Whew, wow. That was good. You should publish that essay. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, but okay. No, that's a really great question because I think what you've identified is this, well, a couple things I can think of. Without being myself a scientist, right, and being able to speak from the field that you're operating from, the idea too of collectivity or a sharing of knowledge, information, or authorship or creativity in the art world is also problematic, because we are operating within a framework of capitalism and recognition and authorship, right? That wants to always pin down who does what and why, and then compensate them, hopefully. I guess the problem, though, is that it gets lopsided because there's not enough space for everybody. And so at a certain point, people have to start, they create their own structures. So DIY, gallery spaces, exhibitions, publications, etc. And the irony is, though, that once those things start to get hold, usually they wind up turning into the institution in some way. And you guys have probably noticed this in the Countercultures class, too, because if you look at some of the artists and projects that started off in a kind of counterculture DIY way, they themselves become part of the canon. And so the question then maybe isn't, okay, do you avoid that? Because you can, that's one strategy. Or if you find yourself in some form of power, can you leverage that to give as much as possible to those that don't have it? And that's maybe if it's just speaking for myself, maybe that's my privilege, and that's also my, cross to bear. So it's kind of, but yeah, there are parallels, and I do think that the idea of sharing is only resonant for those that have enough surplus to share. Like, in other words, like if you're just struggling to get by and all of a sudden I come along and say, let's just be collective about this, pool all our ideas together and you'll get nothing. That doesn't work.
Thank you. That was just riveting. It really was. I'm always confused by public engagement, and I'm not confused anymore. But one of the things I wondered, so like in the crochet project, and then the one in Taiwan with the money and all of that, you talk so much about overhearing the conversations that people were having about their life goals or whatever. And I'm wondering, did you record anything? Or any type of, did you learn any big things that you then recorded and shared, like how people do you know what I'm saying, like so that there's learning beyond, once the exhibition is shut down, that then there's something that some big
Sure, like
idea.
An archive or something like that. And yeah, unfortunately, I didn't go that far with it, because that's another level of cataloging and time. And usually, because I'm the one that runs those workshops, I'm usually so busy, actually like talking to people, that it seems it changes it to also document it too much, because then what happens is that I'm creating more product. Even though it's an archive of something that's ephemeral and free or whatever, but I kind of, I sort of like let it go, But it's an interesting question. Sure, yeah.
Regarding the Louis Vuitton cease and desist letter, many other artists who've received those kinds of things have turned that into a art project or a art piece or something like that. Question is, did you consider that, and did you discontinue the project when you got the letter?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I actually didn't want to give them too much credit. In the sense that, I talk about the letter. So in moments like this when I'm presenting it, but I never show it, in a formal space. I never create a thing around it, because I actually don't want to, I didn't want the project to be about them. Weirdly enough, I wanted it to be about the makers. And so Louis Vuitton sent me about 5 registered mail cease and desists directly from Paris, over the course of a year. And it was kind of frightening at first, but I got some kind of informal counsel from a lawyer, a copyright lawyer, a friend of mine actually, who was a Princeton law professor and crochet enthusiast. So he just showed up at one of my workshops once, and we just started talking, and he said, "Oh, guess what? I'm a copyright professor." And so he advised me on it. He said they really don't have anything to stand on. I mean, part of it really is that they like to scare people, and sometimes it's too much trouble to go through those motions to actually push through it. But I do think it was pivotal for the project in my thinking, because it made me realize that even metaphors have effects in the world. I think, are we good?
Yeah, we're good. Almost one last, maybe sorry. We're good. I know you want to go.
Oh, no, I can stand here all day.
If you could talk about the project where you, your self-sustainability, because when I said perhaps the most interesting aspect of your career so far is that you were born and raised in San Francisco, and that today you have a sustainable art world practice, academy practice in public. So you have, if you could talk about the project that you did as a sustainable, sewing your own clothing, as a sustainable business, because I now see you as a sustainable business. Do you see yourself as a sustainable business today?
That's funny. Well, I guess to address that, so a lot of people, there's this idea of what the artist does for a living. And the artist is supposed to be, you go to your studio, you tear your hair out, you throw paint around, and then, you wait for someone to tap you on the shoulder to recognize your genius, and then you may or may not enter the art market. And that never really, I did that for a while, and then it never really stuck. I realized that, to be as interesting of an artist in the world, in order to reflect my own interests, which were so varied and huge. And I worked for a while too as a graphic designer, an exhibitions designer at the Exploratorium Museum. So I had a lot of experience designing kind of publicly interfacing projects. So yeah, I've had various jobs, as a designer, as a teacher, as an artist now, and now as a professor. And it's the most amazing thing about this type of work is that I don't really think anymore about if what I do is art, or if what I do is work, or if what I do is activism or a project. Like it's all work to me, and I like that bleed and that fluidity. So maybe in this Venn diagram, right, there's a more clustery kind of in the middle of those things, and then there's these outliers that happen because sometimes I do have to operate in different fields. But it's, not to be a booster too much of it, but I'm shocked to be sustaining myself as an artist. I love it, but I think partly it's because, I make art oddly, or I don't do it the right way, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense sometimes.
Can I maybe just add a short last question? Thanks a lot. I was just wondering if you give a special attribute to education or the educational purpose, like in these diagrams between the academy and the public. What is the role of education? I was thinking also of the Thomas Hirschhorn projects, like the Karl Marx Capital. And so what are you thinking of education and your role as a professor and how these fields come together?
There's like a phantom other circle floating between public and academy, and that's pedagogy. And so what I didn't show today are a lot of the projects that I tried to instigate as a teacher with my students in my classes to co-create or make things. And unfortunately, just because of time, I didn't include those examples. But it's a huge one. And with the workshop format that I run, also there's a lot of time spent. Sometimes these are Trojan horse projects where you're learning or you're going through the motions of something in order to figure something out, but you only understand that at the end. So pedagogy is. I should have spent more time today talking about it, but I think about it a lot.
So, in fact, you were talking about it the whole time, I think. But thank you so much, Stephanie. We're going to end it here, that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Natasha, too.